I'll get going with the introduction then. Welcome. Good morning, afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest Lælingen Brewing We Brew With You online lecture. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Robert Percival. I'm Technical Sales Manager for Lælingen Brewing. And it's my job today to introduce a special guest to talk about the fascinating world of a unique group of yeasts, Kveik. Kveik as a topic has been receiving a huge amount of interest recently for application in both home and commercial brewing, gaining wide attention globally for possessing unique fermentation characteristics. Native to Norway, a number of Kveik strains and cultures have recently been produced commercially and are now widely available for any brewer to use. Indeed, in January of this year, Lælingen Brewing released BREWER'S, the first mass-market commercially produced dried Kveik culture strain. And for any of you wanting any in-depth information on this strain, this can of course be found on the Lælingen Brewing website. And I'd also highly recommend David Heath's Homebrew YouTube channel. And there is a video specific to the launch of this strain, and I'll be sure to send a copy of the link to David's video in the comments for this stream. Before introducing our speaker for today's lecture, I'd just like to say a few words on my own interest and discovery of Kveik. It was nearly exactly 3 years ago to the day. It was May the 11th, 2017 to be precise. I was giving a talk on sour beer production and the application of lactic acid producing bacteria at a conference in Bratislava, of all places. And during a break in the conference, a home brewer brought over a sample of beer he'd recently brewed and asked me if I'd like to try it. How could I refuse? He said it'd been brewed with Kveik, which instantly got my attention. I'd heard about this group of farmhouse yeast from Norway, but beyond basic information and hearsay, I'd never actually tried a beer fermented with a Kveik culture. So before trying the beer, the brewer described the recipe and the fermentation profile in some detail, stating that it had been fermented at around 40 degrees Celsius and it had fully attenuated in little over 24 hours. So quite frankly, I naturally thought he was mad, and I was skeptical to say the least. I had a relatively formal and traditional brewing education and training, and this extreme fermentation profile that the brewer described, I was of the assumption that it would surely result in all manner of stress-related off-flavors, such as acetaldehyde, diacetyl, sulfur, etc. And I really had no idea what I was about to try. Suffice to say, the beer was absolutely outstanding. It really, I think, blew my mind and was one of those moments that you remember when you're kind of discovering things in beer. I'm sure we've all had those moments, and this was certainly one of those for me. The taste and aromatics were unique and very interesting, and the brewer had actually used a version of the Voss culture, so orange blossom and flavor and aroma was prominent, but crucially, it was very clean, without any hints of what we would describe as off flavors. So instantly, I was absolutely fascinated and caught the Kveik bug straight away, reading all the articles I could find, which of course were mostly written by today's speaker, and collecting as many Kveik culture samples from a whole host of different sources that I could get my hands on. 3 years later, you can imagine how exciting it has been to be part of bringing BREWER'S to the market. And I think what I found really fascinating about Kveik is that it is so far removed and so far outside of our understanding and experience of what we generally refer to as typical brewing yeast or typical ale yeast. And this is certainly something that we're going to dip into during the lecture. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker, Lars Marius Garshol. Lars is a software engineer from Norway who travels the world to learn more about beer. He spent half a decade researching various aspects of brewing at remote farms throughout Scandinavia, the Baltics, and Russia. He's the author of Lars' blog, a blog devoted to sharing his discoveries and travels as he researches the lost art of farmhouse brewing in Northern Europe, Historical Brewing Techniques, the lost art of farmhouse brewing, and a book on Lithuanian beer. He lives with his wife and daughter in Rælingen in Norway. No doubt I've pronounced that horribly incorrectly. Apologies, Lars. But it's no overstatement to say that Kveik is, as it now is, as a global phenomenon, can largely be attributed to Lars's writing and influence. And we're very lucky and very grateful to have you with us today, Lars. And I will make sure during this presentation that I will send a link to Lars's blog in the comments section, which is a real treasure trove of articles and information. And as well as the online blog, Lars's new book, Historical Brewing Techniques, The Lost Art of Farmhouse Brewing, is available to order now. And I'm pleased to say I have my copy already here, yet to be signed by the author, but maybe one day. So, hi Lars, how are you?
Hi there, doing fine, thank you.
Good. Well, I know that you were meant to, of course, be on tour in North America right now, giving talks as part of your book tour, but despite the obvious restrictions on travel now, you seem to be highly in demand and busy giving talks on Kveik recently.
Yeah, I'm kind of traveling online from online show to online show. It's a kind of replacement, and it's great for people who don't live in North America, who don't, otherwise never see this stuff.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And well, we obviously really appreciate your time to.
Oops. Looks like Robert dropped out. I'll give him a moment to come back, and if he doesn't, I'll just start the talk. Yeah, hello to Japan and Paris. Clearly Finland as well. Okay, I don't see any information about what to do, but since Robert dropped out, I will just start the talk. I trust someone will tell me if I don't put the slides on correctly. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this online talk, and thank you to Lallemand for hosting me. As I think you'll see in this talk, Kveik had, how shall I put it, quite humble beginnings. So I, and also many of the Kveik brewers, are very happy to see a major yeast producer like Lallemand actually put the yeast on the market, because it's a real stamp of quality, if you like. So this talk is not a how do you use Kveik talk, although you will learn a little bit about that. This talk is about kind of my personal journey into Kveik and toward discovering what it actually is. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride that goes through quite a few different things. So for me personally, this all began 8 years ago, when some friends of mine had bought a bottle of beer, and obviously not the one on the right, the one on the left, in central Norway, and taken it home. And people were so excited by this bottle that it was actually, people would unscrew the cork, have a small sample and try it, and then pass it on to the next person. And when I got this beer, I, of course, realized why, because it didn't actually taste like any other kind of beer that I'd ever had. And it wasn't that there was one new thing about it that stood out. It was really like it was a new kind of beer, some kind of beer that according to my understanding of beer, shouldn't exist at all, because there weren't supposed to be any specifically Norwegian types of beer. So I got really, really interested and wanted to find out what was this and where did it come from. And I quite quickly realized that this was something from the Norwegian tradition of farmhouse brewing that I had heard of and kind of vaguely knew existed, but didn't really know anything specific about. And then the following year, I was invited to brew with a brewer in Western Norway, and just went out there to see what it would be like. And when you see this photo of the brew house, you can kind of see immediately that this is not a modern home brewer. This is not a commercial brewer. And in fact, if you look at his kettle there, he's clearly not brewing normal homebrew styles, but he was not selling the beer. So what I learned from this this brew session was that he was actually making a different kind of beer, and it wasn't a modern beer because he'd never learned modern brewing. He'd just been taught a sequence of steps that he had to go through that would make beer. And if you always did the same sequence of steps, you would always get the same beer. But why each step was there, nobody had told him that, because this was really an ancient tradition for brewing where people were mainly taught by their parents how to brew. Something that has really been passed on down many, many generations. Now, this brewer was using commercial yeast. But when I started to dig deeper after this visit, I found this book that you see here, which is an ethnographic description of Norwegian farmhouse brewing. And quite far into it, I found this description of how people used their yeast in the old days. And it turned out that people all over Norway had their own yeast. And these photos that you see are equipment that people used to harvest and reuse the yeast. I remember looking at this this book and thinking, what must all this beer have tasted like? What must all of these yeasts have been like? And I got really fascinated with that. And then when I started digging deeper, I found this article by Michael Jackson, published in 1992. And he goes to Western Norway and he brews with some traditional brewers, much like I did. And then you see this quote that's emphasized here. Some of the brewers he talked to say, our yeast is and will always be our father's. It's his yeast and it's still alive. And they made it sound like this was the same kind of thing I read about in the book, like these yeasts were still around. I did some more searching and was able to find someone who had collected this type of yeast in 2008, but that was it. That was all I was able to find out. So in this area called Voss, people clearly had some kind of yeast. They said it was old, and that's basically all that I could find out. And when I saw what people were saying about it on homebrewer forums and so on, they were quite skeptical. Didn't really believe that people in Voss could keep their own yeast going for decades. And they didn't really believe that this could be clean and pure yeast. They were sure it had to be wild yeast and mixed up with bacteria and producing sour flavors and all of that. And I didn't know. I just thought, well, this is interesting anyway. So we managed to find, after many months of searching, a farmhouse brewer in Voss by the name of Sigmund Gjernes. It's the one you see on the right there. And when you see this brew house, you can see that although Sigmund has whitewashed his brewery, it's essentially the same kind, right? It's got the wooden fire, it's got the same kind of copper kettle and the same kind of size. Clearly, he's part of the same tradition. And Sigmund very kindly invited us to stay in his house for 24 hours and watch him go through the whole brewing process. So before we carry on, Voss is in Western Norway. As you can see, it's north of pretty much all of Europe. It's only parts of Sweden and Finland that are this far north. So this is quite far out on the periphery of Europe. And if we zoom in on Norway, this is Western Norway. You see, Voss is away from the sea. And the way that people traveled in Western Norway all the way up to the 1960s, when cars became common, was actually by sea. So Voss is a place that's really been quite isolated and really until the 1960s, which is just 60 years ago, which of course is a major part of the story that is to follow. So when we brewed with Sigmund, the first thing that he did was to fill his copper kettle with water, stuff it full of juniper branches, and then start the fire underneath. Because in Norwegian farmhouse brewing, you don't brew with water. You brew with juniper infusion, a kind of herbal infusion that you make from these branches. And when Sigmund was doing this, he brought out the sieve that you see in the photo there and started using it down in the kettle. And of course, I asked him, so why are you doing this? And he says, well, you know, all sorts of things come with this juniper, like spiders. You don't want that in the brew, he said. Now, this photo is from when we tried it ourselves, and yeah, he wasn't exaggerating. In practice, of course, it's all filtered out, so it doesn't really matter. But Sigmund is a careful guy, and he wanted to remove these things. So it turned out that his ingredients for his Voss farmhouse ale was juniper branches, Pilsner malts, Saaz hops, and his own yeast. And I remember thinking, that's really weird, because that's like a Pilsner with a strange yeast and juniper branches. And I couldn't believe that this was really how he made his beer. So he told us that he didn't have any beer left. And of course, we were eager to see what was he was making. But he had some dregs left that he didn't really want to serve. And we managed to convince him that he should serve this. I'm getting paranoid now. I need to check that I'm actually on, that everything's okay. Yeah. Looks like it's okay. I'll carry on. So this beer that he didn't really want to sell, service, because it was just the dregs. The first thing that we noticed when we got it in the glass was that this is dark. Didn't he say he was using old Pilsner malts? And it smelled of oranges, and that also didn't make any sense. So we realized that the most likely source of this flavor must be the Kveik, which of course made us really interested at all, because in 2014, nobody had ever heard of yeast making orange flavor. So once he's finished with the mashing, he does lautering like this through the juniper branches. Takes many hours to get the wort out, because this filter is, of course, not that good. Then he puts all the wort into this big kettle, which takes like 340 liters, and he starts boiling. And again, he's out with the sieve, and of course, again, I'm asking him, why are you doing this? And he says, we call this foam the headache. Of course, you have to remove the headache, he says. And that usually makes people laugh, but what he says is that you get some oils from the juniper that are not good for you, and they give you a headache, and they settle out in this foam. So if you remove the foam, people are less likely to get a headache. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. And I don't know that anybody else knows either. And it's never been tested scientifically. And when you see this photo of the kettle, on the left-hand side there, you see this dark band going almost half the way up. That's how high the wort was in the kettle when he started boiling. So he boils for 4 hours plus, literally boils away half the wort. So he starts with 300 liters and boils it down to 150. And the purpose, of course, is to get as much, get a concentrated wort. And of course, this is also where the color comes from. So you see here from when we tried it ourselves, on the right-hand side is the wort that we started with, which really looks like Pilsner wort. And then on the left is the wort that boiled for, I think, 3 hours with gas. So Sigmund uses much stronger heat. So he gets something that looks almost like a kind of brownish red wine. And of course, this gives you a caramel flavor as well. And then while it was boiling, out comes this glass. We put it on the table outside in the sun. And it's when I saw this glass that I realized that, oh shit, this is true. He really does have this kind of heritage yeast that we thought. So what he does is he unscrews the lid and he goes, psht. So there's life in there. And you see this column of bubbles just rising up on the photo there. These bubble columns started rising up, and I realized that this stuff was actually alive. He was he'd put this in the fridge the last time he brewed, so it was collected from the previous brew, and then of course that came from the brew before that, and so on backwards. So Sigmund had this tribe of microscopic animals living in his fridge, and he said he'd inherited it from his uncle. And Sigmund's problem here is, unlike Lallemand, he doesn't have a QA lab. So all he knows is he's got this brown sludge, and it made good beer last time. That's what he knows. And now it's been put away for about 6 months. So what he does to check that it's good is he takes a spoon and he takes this dark liquid that you see on top and tastes it. That's to see whether the yeast is still good. And when we did that, it was like, it was really, really intense, because this is, of course, all the liquid that there is, and all of the flavor is seeped into that for 6 months. So it was like having a marmalade glass smashed over your head, basically. But Sigmund tasted it and said, yeah, this is excellent. This is good stuff. We can go. But in the old days, this is not what they did. They used to use rings like these. So this is constructed from interlocking wooden pieces, and you end up with a shape that's quite interesting, because it doesn't take up a lot of volume, but it has a very large surface area. So when you drag this through the yeast slurry or the foam on top, it's really good for catching the yeast. And you see the little string on top there. He uses that to just hang it up once the yeast is fastened to the ring, and then it dries on the ring. So then when you want to brew with it, you just take some of the wort, let it cool, and then you just dump the whole thing in. So this is 10 minutes past 10, as you see on the upper left. That's the timestamp on this photo. This is 4.5 hours later, and it's fermenting. And of course, it smelled of oranges. So that's when we knew for sure that, okay, this was where the flavor came from. And then when he was he had finished boiling, he had cooled the wort, he'd put it into the fermenter, which is the yellow thing that you see here. He wrapped it with this insulation board around the whole thing. And we looked at that and thought, well, that's really weird. Aren't you, like, why are you doing this? And he says, oh, it's so the fermenting beer won't get too cold. And usually that's not what people worry about. And that's when we asked him, how hot do you brew? And he says, 39°C. And of course, he can see in our faces that we are like, what did you just say? So I can still remember looking like this and then hearing him say mildly, well, my brother measured it to 42 during fermentation, as if that made it better. In a nearby valley, they used to pitch actually at 42. So he probably went even higher. The people up there have heard that that's too hot. So I'm told that now they've turned it down to 37. And we came back, let's see, 4 days later, and then the beer was ready. That's the day when he takes it out of the fermenter. And it was good stuff. just as Robert was saying, none of the fusel flavors, acetaldehyde, any of that stuff. Really clean, fruity, lightly spicy, orangey flavor, and of course, massive caramel from the boil. And a good dose of bitterness from the juniper. Very good beer. And at this point, I was, of course, hooked on Kveik. And one thing that we learned on this trip, we went to other places beside Voss, was that it seemed like there were more regions in Western Norway where they still had this Kveik yeast. So I made another journey the year after to another part of Western Norway, which is a good bit north of Voss. It's actually another area that, like Voss, is a good-sized agricultural district that's not by the sea, so has been isolated for basically the same reason. And here I met Terje Raftevold, who you see in the photo. Again, you see that it's roughly the same kind of brewing, right? This is exactly like Sigmund's LAUTERING tun, except it's plastic instead of metal. Terje learned to brew from his uncle when he was 17. His uncle, in turn, learned to brew from Terje's grandma in 1944 when he was 14. So it's the same thing here. The knowledge of how to brew has been passed on through the generations, basically by each generation learning from the one before them. And, of course, getting the yeast together with it. So unlike Sigmund, Terje doesn't boil the wort. He doesn't even boil the hops. So he has a completely different brewing process because he's from a different part of the country. And here, just like Sigmund, Terje has taken off some of the first wort that he ran off from the Lauter tun, and he's making his yeast starter. And when he does that, Terje looks at me and he says, here we call this Marius, which is a bit strange because literally that word means Mari's eyes. Mari is a common Norwegian woman's name. And the eyes thing kind of makes sense, right? Here's the fermenting wort and the bubbles kind of look like eyes. But this Mari part didn't make sense to me until I found it in a 19th century dictionary. It actually means the eyes of the Virgin Mary. So Maria, not Mari. And this must be a pretty old word because Norway left the Catholic Church in 1537. And the worship of the Virgin Mary was then frowned upon basically ever since. So what Terje does when he makes his starter is this plastic box that you see. That has dried yeast chips. And those they keep in the freezer. So his father-in-law has them in the freezer. So Terje went there the same morning, picked them up, and then just had them in the brew house because now it's 2:30 and they've thawed. So he just drops them straight into the cooled wort. And again, 14:30 is the timestamp on my photo. This is 31 minutes later. So it's already fermenting visibly, which is perfectly normal for this yeast. So if it hadn't started this quickly, Terje would have gotten worried and probably gone home to get another box. And once he's run off all the wort and he's cooled all of it, he's done. He puts it into this fermenting tank, takes the Virgin Mary's eyes and just tips it in. And then 48 hours later, there is a party. So in Western Norway, there's this tradition that when your beer has finished fermenting and you're racking it, the neighbors will show up for a tasting. So some places it's a really formal thing and you have to be invited. In other places, people just see the smoke from the brew house and they know, okay, Terje is brewing. Okay, Sunday now, that means it'll be done Tuesday evening. So Tuesday evening, 15, 20 people just show up and there's a party in the brew house. And the beer really is finished fermenting pretty much after 48 hours. So at this point, I went home and felt basically mystified. So Kveik was clearly something special because of the fermentation temperatures, these new flavors, the speed of fermentation, the fact that it could be dried. But it wasn't at all clear what it was. I didn't know anything more than Sigmund, who knew that, okay, I've got this brown sludge, it will make good beer. And although they told me where they had gotten the yeast from, because I asked both of them carefully, we couldn't follow the trail very far back. So in the case of Sigmund, he got it from his uncle in 1988. His uncle had it from the family farm. And then the trail goes cold because his uncle is dead. And it's the same thing with Terje. He got it from a friend got it from the family farm, from people who are now dead. And with all of the Kveik yeasts where I've tried to trace the origins, it's the same thing. You can follow the chain and then you get to somebody who's dead and nobody knows what happened before that. So to figure out what this is and where it comes from, we have to take another tack. So I have to look at basically the history of this type of brewing and the history of yeast to try and kind of get a feel for how you can actually place this at all. So historically, in Norway and other places in the world, people generally made their living by growing grain and then eating it, literally. So most farms were almost completely self-sufficient. They would buy things like a metal kettle, for example, but almost everything else, including their clothes, they made themselves. So in the autumn, they would have all of this grain that they had harvested, and the only thing that remained at that point before they had beer was just to put in some work. So this is actually quite interesting that one of the things, only one of them, that drove the extinction of farmhouse ale in Norway was when people started to be able to afford coffee. So coffee cost money. It wasn't until you were part of the money economy that you could actually buy coffee. Beer, on the other hand, you could actually make completely for free. As long as you had enough grain to eat, you could set some of it aside and you didn't need to buy anything at all to make the beer. And this is something that started a long, long time ago. This is a Danish burial mound. 3,500 years ago, a girl was buried in here with a birch bark bucket containing beer. It was put into the grave together with her. Of course, that was also farmhouse ale. They didn't buy that from a brewery because there were no breweries back then. So if you look at the history of beer in really a bird's eye view, then in the beginning, there was only farmhouse ale. The people brewed on the farm for the people on the farm and drank it there. And it wasn't until roughly the 1200s that Northern Europe developed cities of any size. And when you have a city, you have people who basically can't grow any grain, and you have a lot of people in the same place. So all the way around the city, there will be people who have been brewing since forever, and they will eventually realize that, hey, in the city, there's people who can't brew. I can make money by selling them beer. Then, of course, eventually the brewery moves into the city, and you get the beginnings of commercial brewing. And then the Germans came up with this idea of boiling the wort with hops in it, which meant that you could not only sell in your own town, but you could export the beer to other towns. And that started an explosive development where the size of breweries grew quite dramatically. So within, by the end of the 1300s, people had brewing kettles that were 4,000 or 5,000 liters in size. Now, at that point, you're no longer a farmhouse brewery. And this development continued. So in the 18th century, we got the porter breweries in London that were doing millions and millions of liters, and they had steam engines and so on. And then this, of course, developed into modern industrial brewing with purified yeast, saccharometers, thermometers, all of this fancy stuff. And the today's home brewers and today's craft brewers, they basically come out of the same line of development. They have roughly the same way of thinking. They use the same equipment. These all make the same styles of beer. And meanwhile, on the farms, basically nothing happened. The same kind of brewing just went on and on and on. And there weren't a whole lot of technological innovations. As you saw, Sigmund and Carlo and Terje as well in 2020 still use copper kettles with a wooden fire. So the biggest technological improvement that happened there was basically the introduction of the garden hose, because that meant that, think of Sigmund, he needs, what does he need? 350 liters of water just for the mashing, and then even more for the cleaning and so on. That's a lot of water to haul up of the well and carry. So the garden hose is actually a godsend for a farmhouse brewer. So historically, all of these people who brewed their own beer, they also had their own yeast. So each of these yellow dots is marks a place where I have documentation that in this specific place, historically people did have their own yeast that they used for brewing. Now the places where there are no dots is just places where I don't have the documentation for the most part. People had their own yeast all over. And then there was a quite major transition, which was actually started by Louis Pasteur. So the main thing that Pasteur did was that he showed brewers how to use the methods of modern microbiology to study their own yeast. And one brewery that really ran with this idea was Carlsberg. So their lab chief, Emil Christian Hansen, he started working with microscopes and all of this stuff. And then Carlsberg's yeast in the autumn of 1883 turned bad. And Hansen came up with this method where he could dilute the yeast down to single cells. And then he could grow the yeast back, but always from a single cell. And he could show that there were 4 kinds of yeast in the Carlsberg yeast. 2 of them made the beer sick, and they were wild yeast from the orchard across the street. And 2 of them were the original lager yeast. So he came up with this apparatus that you see here that could be used to grow the yeast back to industrial pitch size in a way that you could be absolutely sure that it was pure. So this introduced the use of purified yeast that everybody now uses. And in lager brewing, it took over completely within the end of the 1890s. So within 15 years, basically. And what's worth being aware of here is that Carlsberg, Anheuser-Busch, when they started, every brewery that you know of that started before 1893, when they started, they were taking the yeast from one batch, putting it into the next batch, putting it into the next batch. And many of them did this for decades, even centuries, until comes the autumn of 1883, and they switched to Hansen's method, where you take out an amount of yeast, you reuse it a few times, then you throw it away, and you start over. And the benefit of this approach is that it will happen under normal circumstances, certainly in a craft brewery, that other stuff gets into your pitching yeast, microbes that you don't want there. But if you only reuse it a few times, these don't have time to develop into something that you can taste. You throw away the yeast before the infection grows big enough to taste when you start over. And of course, what happened with the Kveik brewers was that they never noticed this. They just kept going when everybody changed to Hansen's method. And of course, this is why everybody was so concerned with what their yeast was like, right? Had they gotten all of these infections and then that was what they were brewing with, or what? Now, I said that lager breweries switched to Hansen's method before the turn of the 20th century. But for ale breweries, it was actually a different story. So Labatt in Canada were still using mixed yeast that had never been purified as late as the 1980s. The same with a lot of the Belgian breweries, ale breweries. And then there's Harvey's in Sussex in the UK. This is their yeast in the yeast room. So they actually still harvest the yeast and repitch it. So this yeast they bought from another brewery in 1950. It came to their brew house by train, and they have been reusing it ever since. It's never been purified. There are 2 strains of brewer's yeast in there, and 2 strains of a very rare species. They make fantastic beer. Works beautifully. So in the world of farmhouse brewing, several things happened. So one was that the tradition for farmhouse brewing started dying out because it became easier to buy beer, or you could buy coffee and serve your visitors coffee instead. And also baking yeast started becoming available for sale. So gradually, all of these places lost their yeast cultures. I've spoken to people from Estonia, for example, who remembered having their own yeast in the early 1990s, and then they switched to baking yeast, and the old yeast died out, disappeared. But in some places, it's hung on. So this is the places where we know for a fact that people still have farmhouse yeast. They are reusing. It's very likely that there are dots missing here, but we don't know where they are. That's still ongoing work to find them. So coming back from this trip to Western Norway, I of course wanted to know what was this yeast that I collected. So this is the box that I put it into, and I sent it to the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in Norwich, UK. And they sent me back an analysis saying, well, Sigmund's yeast contains only yeast, nothing else, no bacteria. And they weren't really surprised by that, because their experience is the yeast is quite good at protecting itself against contaminants. They also said it was all Saccharomyces cerevisiae, ale yeast, and that there were 3 strains. So this is worth being aware that Sigmund brews with this culture of many strains that he inherited and that he keeps reusing. Lallemand has taken 1 strain from that culture and is selling it. And if you buy Voss from some other supplier, it probably comes from Sigmund's culture as well, but it might not be the same strain. So what you see in the top photo here is the analysis that NCYC did that showed the 3 different types. There's these white bands to show us what genes the yeast has, and that's how we can see that there are 3 types. Now, in the photo below is yeast from another brewer that was collected 6 years earlier. And this other brewer lives a few kilometers away from Sigmundhjernes. And the lab said that they could see from the way that these lines match up in the photo that these yeasts had to be related. Probably they were the same yeast some decades ago, but they couldn't say how many decades. Of course, the trouble here is, okay, we know it's the same species as ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but this species contains English ale yeast, Hefeweizen yeast, Belgian yeast, Saison yeast, but also wine yeast, wild yeast, baker's yeast, Japanese sake yeast, even more obscure stuff. So it wasn't really a big surprise to find that this was the species of yeast that normally is used in any kind of fermentation. But that's not very useful. It's like, okay, somebody wants to sell you a dog. It would be nice to know what kind of dog. And similarly with this. So we still didn't know it was Kveik brewer's yeast, was it wild yeast, or was it some third thing like sake yeast, like this completely unrelated branch of yeast? And what I found out quite quickly from talking to the microbiologists was that this is not a simple question. It actually takes a lot of background knowledge to be able to ask the right questions and to understand the answers. So I'm going to present some basic microbiology to explain the landscape here. So where does brewer's yeast come from? Well, it comes from nature, where or came originally from nature, I guess is more correct to say, where it lives in the wild and eats the kind of sugar that it can find. For example, tree sap, like you see here. So these outgrowths on trees are places where you can often find Saccharomyces cerevisiae in the wild. And then when people started brewing, of course, we don't know when people brewed the first beer, but what we do know is they must have fermented it with wild yeast because nothing else existed at that point. So it must have spontaneously fermented. You make wort, just leave it there to be inoculated from the air, and it will ferment by itself. And then gradually, people will have figured out that actually, if you have a really good beer, then if you don't clean the fermenter, probably the next beer is going to be good too. In fact, this fermenter that we didn't clean, this is a really good fermenter, and we're going to keep reusing it, and we're not going to clean it. There are actually people in this world, not in Europe, but in South America, who brew beer in this way today. So they don't know what yeast is. They just know that they shouldn't clean the fermenter. And then at some point, people figure out that, oh, it's not about the fermenter. It's this the sludge that sometimes is on top and sometimes is at the bottom. That's actually what matters. And you can just keep that and reuse it. And that's when people switch over to the classic pre-1883 method of reusing the yeast in the way that Terje and Sigmund do. And what's interesting is that if you think about it, what kind of technology do you need to do this? Basically, almost nothing. This piece of wood that you see here is a Norwegian yeast log, but that's more sophisticated than what you really need. Some people just use the ring of straw. In fact, when I visited this other brewer near Sigmund, Svein Rivenes, he told me that in the old days, his grandpa did use a ring of straw. And after he said that, his eyes kind of glossed over, and he said, I can picture him in my mind now. Grandpa would hang the yeast under the eaves of the barn because it's airy there and it would dry quickly. And I can picture him taking it down. You know, the birds would shit on this ring, he said, and Grandpa would just take a knife and scrape off the shit and throw this in the starter. And then he laughed, like he couldn't really believe this, but that's what he said. Anyway, the basic idea is that the technology that you need to reuse yeast already existed in the Stone Age. So very likely people have been doing this for a long, long time. And when you keep reusing the yeast over time, it adapts to living in the brew house. Like a dog adapts to living with humans instead of living in the wild. So what happens is there will be chance mutations that happen while the beer is fermenting. And if this new cell that's developed has a mutation that's of advantage to it, it'll grow faster than the other strains of yeast that are in there. And it will grow faster exponentially. Kind of like the virus, right? So it doesn't take that many brews before this new strain has taken over completely. And the old, less adapted strain is gone, or strains. So being able to eat more of the sugars that are typical for wort, that don't exist in nature, for example, that's one of these mutations. Being able to tolerate alcohol is another. And also being able to flocculate out. Flocculation is really, really important to this yeast because any yeast that remains in suspension in the beer when the beer is racked is going to go into somebody's stomach and die. So the yeast actually has tremendous pressure on it to flocculate out of the beer and be collected. And then the other thing that happens is that some of the genes that were important to the yeast in the wild that aren't important anymore. They decay. So this is like when you find fish that live in a cave in the mountains, right? It's pitch black in there. So these fish have no use for eyes. And when you look at this type of fish, generally there are eyes there, but they don't work because the genes have broken down. And since the fish doesn't get punished evolutionary for this, over time, all of the fish have eyes that don't work. And this is something similar to what happened to brewer's yeast. For example, it lost the ability to survive drying. So wild yeast can be dried, but the brewer's yeast usually can't, because in the brewery, it stays wet for a little period and then it goes back in the next brew. It never dries. So this ability to handle drying gets lost. So if we make a table of the key properties that distinguish wild yeast from brewer's yeast, it looks like this. Differences in alcohol tolerance, flocculation, and so on. And what's interesting about this table is that we here have a guide to classification. If we compare the properties of Kveik with wild and brewer's yeast, we will be able to see which type it's most similar to. And there's one more property that we need to look at, which is generally considered the main marker, and that's production of phenols. So all wild yeasts are phenolic. They produce 4-vinyl guaiacol. And that's not because the wild yeast is interested in phenols. It's because, as I told you earlier, they live in trees and in tree sap and eat the sugar there, but the tree wants the sugar for itself. So they make acids that are harmful to the yeast, and wild yeast, wild Saccharomyces cerevisiae, has learned to destroy those acids, and that process turns them into phenols. Of course, in the brewery, this is not needed because the acids are present in wort, but there's so little of them that it doesn't harm the yeast. So there are some brewer's yeast that make this aroma, but most don't. So basically, any yeast that is non-phenolic is obviously domesticated. It's obviously brewer's yeast. That's one of the easiest ways to make the distinction. So to go back to this high-level history of yeast, this major transition from not really knowing what yeast is and what it does to beginning to reuse the yeast, that happened in the Stone Age. We know from documentation that it's literally millennia ago that people made this transition. And the second change that happened, the introduction of Hansen's method. After Hansen's method was introduced, the yeast started evolving much more slowly, because one of the purposes of Hansen's method is to pin down the yeast and stop it mutating and changing. In other words, the domestication of yeast happened before that and after people started reusing the yeast. In other words, all of those non-farmhouse yeasts that you can buy, they were also they were domesticated in the period when people were repitching their yeast. So in the period before 1883. Now, I said there are many types of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. We didn't really know what types and how they were related to each other before this major paper appeared in 2016. You see the title of it at the bottom here. What these scientists did was they took more than 100 strains of yeast of different types, sequenced the whole genome, and then built a family tree showing who is more closely related to who. In other words, how these yeasts evolved historically. And what they found, to everyone's surprise, was that there is a family of wild yeasts, those are off to the side, and then there are all the domesticated yeasts on the other side. And it turns out there's two major groups of ale yeast, known as beer 1 and beer 2. And then wine yeast formed another group on the side. And then they have a fifth group there that they call mixed, which consists mainly of beer yeast, baker's yeast, and also some distilling yeasts. And what's very interesting is that this beer 1 family has a clear geographic substructure. So there is a major side branch that holds Belgian and German ale yeasts, and it splits into another group that's then divided in two, which is British and American ale yeasts. So it looks like this beer 1 family arose on the continent and then crossed the channel to Britain and probably from there to the US, which is quite the fascinating result. To give you some perspective of farmhouse yeast, all the saison yeasts belong in the beer 2 family. Of course, now you can kind of see why is saison yeast so different from these others. Well, it's a completely different family of yeast. If we go back to the Kveiks, these are the places that we have collected Kveik cultures from. And you can actually see here that there's a divide between a northern group and a southern group. And the thing that divides them is actually a huge mountain range in the middle with the biggest glacier in Europe, or in continental Europe anyway, on top of it. So there's a big natural divide, and that's why the people north of this glacier, they don't boil their wort, while the people to the south, they do. And we have analyzed most of the cultures that we collected. We find that all of them are Saccharomyces cerevisiae. We also find that all of these cultures collected from all of these places, they are more closely related to each other than to any other yeast. So it's clear that Kveik is a separate family. Sometimes we find bacteria in these cultures, very often not. When there are bacteria in there, usually they don't make any flavor that you can notice. A few times, maybe 2, there have been other yeasts in the Kveik, like Pitchia. And again, you can't taste them. So these brewers have very good control over their yeast, and it turns out the reason is that they rely on taste. So you taste the beer, does it taste good? Okay, we can reuse this yeast. Then, like Sigmund, if you've stored it wet, before you use it again, you taste it, still okay, then we can use it. The moment that there are bad flavors in it, they throw away the yeast. Terje, I showed you him earlier, he's very careful about this. Every time at the oppskåke, the party when they rack the beer, he and his father-in-law are analyzing the beer and deciding, are we going to reuse this batch or are we not going to reuse this batch? So when we look at the properties that Kveik has, it actually has very high alcohol tolerance. It's not phenolic. There's very good attenuation, very good flocculation, ferments quickly. So it's clearly much closer to ale yeast than to wild yeast. In other words, it has to be a domesticated yeast. But there is an intriguing difference here. When it comes to drying and heat tolerance, it's more similar to wild yeast, which is really interesting. And in fact, it turns out some people have used that result to argue that Kveik is less domesticated. I'm going to argue that that's not what has happened. So here is all of the data on fermentation temperatures that I have been able to collect from archive accounts, descriptions of farmhouse brewing all across Europe. And you see the degrees centigrade right to left, and then the height of these bars show how many people ferment in this temperature range. As you can see, there is a giant peak at body temperature, roughly the same temperature that Sigmund ferments at. So in other words, farmhouse brewers all across Europe have all fermented at these very high temperatures. And you should now be thinking of the saison brewers, right, who also ferment this hot. So why are they fermenting so hot? Well, if you picture a farmhouse brewery, they have this wooden container with 150 liters of wort that's just been boiled, right? It takes a long time to cool. And not only that, but The temperature falls sharply in the beginning because there's a big difference with the ambient temperature, but then it falls more and more slowly. So the last step, 40 to 20 degrees, actually takes a long time. And this brewer has probably been working since dawn, literally, and it's now getting late. The brewery wants to go to bed. So every hour they have to wait is an hour they have to stay up, and it also increases the chances of something other than the yeast getting in there and getting started. They don't have, if you saw the photos, right? This is not lab conditions. So the warmer you could ferment, the better your chances of a clean brew. And then we have this thing with drying, which is also not typical for domesticated yeast. So why can Kveik be dried? Well, here is data on where people dried their yeast between brews, that's the yellow dot, and where they didn't, that's a black dot. As you can see, Norway is almost completely yellow. So any kind of yeast that was used in Norway must have been able to handle drying. And the reason is that Norwegian brewers didn't have a lot of grain. So they brewed once or twice a year. And if you don't have a fridge, then it really is best to dry the yeast in between the brews. In other words, if it's kind of, it had to be a yeast that could handle drying. It wouldn't be used in Norway otherwise. And you can see the yeast adapting to how it's used in the flocculation as well. So Sigmund harvests his yeast from the bottom. And when you use his mixed culture, it will flocculate out of a yeast starter or any other container, literally as you watch, just compress down. It takes just a couple of minutes and you have a pretty clean beer, or pretty clean starter. Terje Raftevold harvests from the top, and you can see that on the fermenting beer as well, because it's like porridge on top of the beer. And then you have other brewers who just harvest where they find the yeast, and then you find that yes, the Kveik will flocculate, but if you try to take it up with a spoon, it just goes up. It's like it doesn't know whether it should be on the top or the bottom. And then there is this issue with the fast fermentation. So here is something similar to the pitch temperature diagram, where we have the length of fermentation down the bottom, primary fermentation, and the height of the bars tell you how many people fermented for this amount of time. And you can see that well over half of the brewers were done within 48 hours. In other words, this was normal too. And again, there is a good reason. The yeast is usually faster growing than bacteria and wild yeast and other bad stuff that gets into the beer. So in fact, if you make a home brew and it's infected, usually takes over a week for it to turn sour. So and by that time, Kveik will be finished fermenting for long ago. So the farmhouse brewers have this pressure on them to harvest the yeast early to keep it clean. And of course, this also puts pressure on the yeast to ferment faster so that it grows as much as it can before it gets harvested. So again, this fast fermentation is the yeast adapting to the way that it's being used. In fact, now that I've learned all of this, I realized that I could have just taken the historical sources from the 19th century and early 20th century and predicted the behavior of Kveik from that, just by analyzing the documents. The only exception is the aroma, of course. So this shows very clearly that the brewers have had control of this yeast literally for centuries. And then if we turn back to this, Richard Preece at the Escarpment Labs and a group at the University of Guelph in Canada, they did the whole genome sequencing on 6 Kveik strains. And using that information, they were able to literally take this family tree and place Kveik into it. And it turns out that Kveik fits in basically nearly at the root of the beer 1 tree. So it seems like before the beer 1 yeast went to Britain, it went to Western Norway. which is quite striking. And here, of course, you also see why isn't Kveik like saison yeast, even though they have similar properties? Well, they come from completely different families. That's why one is diastatic, the other isn't. That's why they have different flavors. And the reason that they behave similarly anyway is that they were used in similar ways. They were used on farms where the constraints on the evolving yeast were similar, if not the same. So they ended up with some similarities in the behavior, but their flavor remained different. Now, the analysis of the Kveik genome showed that it seemed to come from two sources. You can see this from the number of copies of the different genes in the yeast. And so the researchers used an algorithm to basically separate the genes out. These seem like they are from ancestor A, and these seem like they are from ancestor B. And then they put those two halves into the family tree separately. And then suddenly it looks like this. So one ancestor is beer 1, and the other ancestor is, well, we don't know. You can see it more clearly here, where you have the beer 1 yeasts at the bottom, the green part of the tree. See the UK, US, Belgium, Germany marked. And then the Kveik is the red bit here. But the other ancestor appears over there, which is no man's land. There's nothing in the tree that's close to those. So what the other ancestor was, we really just don't know. We assume it's a wild yeast, but we don't know for sure. So work is still ongoing to find out what the other ancestor is. I've spent pretty close to an hour. There is a section on brewing with Kveik here, but I'm afraid we don't have time for that. One thing that I really want to emphasize, though, is if you see, this is a more thorough analysis that was done on one of the other Kveiks. So when I say that Sigmund's original culture contained 3 strains, that's not true. What it's really is true is that NCYC, with the method that they used, found 3 strains. If they used this method, maybe they would have found 10, maybe they would have found 15. There are a lot of strains in there. But it should be added that many of the strains are present only in very small amounts. Yeah, sorry about this. So to round off, what is Kveik? It's a domesticated brewer's yeast, descends from continental brewer's yeasts, and some wild ancestor, maybe, or some other ancestor that we don't know what is. So it's a hybrid, actually, just like lager yeast. It's a separate family of yeast, definitely very old, only exists in Western Norway, as far as we know. And I should add that it's a large family. So we've collected, a little bit more than 30 different cultures. If you had used really advanced methods of selecting strains, you could easily get 2,000 or 3,000 strains of yeast out of those cultures. So this is a shockingly large family of yeasts, and they are quite different from each other. They have brewing properties and flavors that are different from those of ordinary brewer's yeast, and the reason is partly the way that they were used, and partly basically genetic accident. What's interesting is that the story doesn't end here. From eastern Norway, we've collected another type of yeast that's called gong. This is from the kitchen of Sverre's Grindo in eastern Norway. He dries the yeast on cloth, like you see here. So what is gong? Where does it fit in the tree? Well, we don't quite know yet. We're working on that. And there are also, of course, non-Norwegian yeasts. So I visited Marina Ivanovna, who you see in the photo here. This is, she's making a yeast starter with sugar and flour you see on the side there. This yeast she inherited from her mother. It's not Kveik, it's something else. Where does that fit? We don't know. So work goes on. Yeah, there is also my book, which has chapter 4 is what you basically got the really, really short version of, which is the history of Kveik yeast and all of these other yeasts and how this all fits together. But it's got many more stories about visiting brewers, malting, how to make raw ale, how to bake your beer in an oven, and so on and so forth. Okay, I will stop there.
Well, hi, Lars, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Did you hear my talk?
I did. I must
Okay, good.
Firstly, apologize. My internet provider let me down just at the last moment of just before I was about to hand over to you. So apologies
That's all right.
for that.
I guess that was going on.
No, and well handled. But firstly, thank you so much for a fascinating talk, and I'm sure we could all sit here for hours and listen to the stories and the history. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating stuff. I mean, we can open questions up now, and I'm happy to answer some myself as well, and I have a few of my own questions for you. So I'll dip into. I've been taking a note of some of the questions and comments as they've come in. So I'll start with one from Casey Flesh. Forgive me if that's not pronounced correctly, but generally speaking, are these drank still, or are these farmhouse ales typically carbonated?
It's the answer is in between. So what you do is they are, of course, racking the beer very early. And although it's mostly fermented out, it's not completely fermented out. So then you put it cold. And before you serve it, you take it out of the cellar and it works up a little bit of carbonation, typically while you're drinking it, which is, when you think about it, the same way the British cask ale is made, right?
Almost exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and for the same reason that historically, when you couldn't measure the sugar, and you didn't have any closed container, it was really difficult to produce carbonated beer. And also, people historically were not used to carbonated drinks at all. They didn't have any at all whatsoever. So probably historically, this light level of carbonation was actually quite exotic for people.
So typically the brewers are kind of drinking fresh and not necessarily into a finished package like a bottle, for example.
They usually rack into quite large plastic containers. And some of them will juggle these around, like take them out of cold storage and then let them ferment a little so they get a little CO2 and then serve it. And it varies how old they let it get. But normally they drink it all within like 2 or 3 months. Sometimes, though, they keep it for a year or 2 years. That happens as well.
Well, fascinating stuff. Thanks for that question, Casey. Another question from Rob Reader. I will find it 1 second. Here it comes up on the screen. Is there a need for a diacetyl rest once final gravity has been reached? Or can it literally be racked once gravity has been achieved? Lars, go ahead. I've got my own comments on this as well.
Well, the chemical analysis shows that it doesn't really produce a lot of diacetyl, so there is no need for that rest, strangely enough.
No, certainly. I mean, I was going to comment similarly. One of my colleagues, Andrew Patterson, recently did a lecture on lager production, and a really fascinating talk, which is available on the Lælingen Brewing Facebook page and the YouTube channel. And Andrew, within that lecture, actually talks about the mechanism of diacetyl production and removal in some detail. So I'd encourage you all to go and look back at that. But I think, firstly, to echo Lars's comments, yes, these strange Kveik cultures don't really seem to produce much diacetyl in the first place, whereas genetically some yeasts obviously will do. But in addition to the fact that they simply don't seem to produce much in the first place, if we think about the mechanism of removal, and typically in a diacetyl rest post fermentation, you'd raise the temperature, or at least keep the temperature warm or relatively warm, to encourage yeast to wort contact and the uptake of diacetyl from the wort into the yeast cell, which is then reduced down to acetone. So the naturally very high fermentation temperatures of Kveik really lend themselves well to very quick uptake of diacetyl, should there be in any wort. So from my relatively limited experience with all the feedback that we've had on our strains, and also my own experience of brewing, is that you can really just go from the end of fermentation straight through to packaging, which is, I think, one of the wonderful things, if we think about modern brewing perspective, that you're essentially bypassing maturation, which has huge, profound impact on beer production in general. I mean, just from a vessel capacity, if nothing else. More questions are flying in, and apologies, I'm struggling to keep up with them all. One from Andre Kregset. What would be the best type of Kveik culture used for a lager style beer? And this actually echoes one question I had. Do you know any farmhouse brewers fermenting at very low temperatures, similar to a lager profile?
There are farmhouse brewers that ferment very cold, or at least, to be more accurate, the pitch very cold. So in Finland, they use this Suomenhiiva baking yeast, and that gets quite wild when if it gets to just go nuts. So quite a few of those brewers will actually cool the wort down to like 4 degrees, pitch the yeast, but then they don't have any cooling, so it will rise slowly to ambient temperature, and fermentation will start that way. But they definitely do not get something like a lager beer. It's more like a Hefeweizen gone crazy.
Wow, so that would be a kind of positive yeast then, I guess.
Yeah, and a lot of banana aroma.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's one of the really interesting...
But to answer his question, though, there is a strain of Kveik that was isolated from some of the Hornindal cultures, but we don't know which ones.
Right.
And because of historical accident, it was called Oslo. But it really produces a very clean and doesn't have much esters or anything like that. So if you do want to make something like a lager, that's a good choice.
Yeah, and I think one of the exciting things about the Kveik cultures, as you alluded to, the sheer diversity in terms of flavor profile and expression. And at Lælingen, we have at least 10 cultures in our collection with a totaling over 50 different strains, and we really see some are very neutral and counter to all kind of known brewing science. It's strange, the warmer that some go, the more neutral they get, which is fascinating. So I'm sure there will be many, quite a few of the Kveik cultures that would actually produce a lager style beer, albeit not necessarily with a traditional lager fermentation profile. And indeed, just one trial that we had in the UK with a brewery when we were testing that was actually they brewed a Bock beer, and that came out phenomenally clean. And you would have thought drinking it that this had been produced using a traditional lagering technique. And this leads into the next question I noticed there, Mark Griffiths. Are there any hops that work well with these strains, New World or Old World?
I think in general, it's more about which Kveik you pick, actually. So Sigmund's tends to work very well with hops, but there are some of the Kveiks that give a bit too much bitterness generally. So Old World, New World hops, they generally all work well with Kveik, I would say. I don't know of any exceptions offhand.
No, and I suppose so much depends on which Kveik culture that you would be using to ferment, because as we've said, the sheer diversity and flavor profile. So if you think you're going to be something like the Hornindal strain, which people describe often as kind of piney and maybe a slight, how that would work with some German hops, but the more piney US hops, for example. And we've had quite a few brewers using kind of quite citrusy hops, I guess, with Voss. So a lot of people brewing kind of modern, not so much bitter, but certainly highly aromatic hop forward beers. And the Bock that I described mentioned briefly, actually used Mandarina Bavaria as a hop. And if we think about the orange notes, that kind of orange peel, orange blossom that we would associate with that hop, that is exactly in keeping with the kind of profile that you would naturally get. So it's interesting, and I think very much a challenge to all brewers out there listening to this. Please feed back, all the combinations of the different cultures and the different hops that you're using, because I think the yeast and hop interactions is something that we can certainly explore more.
Yeah, if you're thinking of the biotransformation, that's still unknown territory. We don't know about that.
Yes, very much so, and that's a real hot topic, of course, at the minute. And in terms of R&D, one of the things that we at Lallemand look at is the beta-glucosidase expression of each brewing strain. And we actually have a document, a best practice document available on our website looking at biotransformation, which gives you the relative beta-glucosidase expression per strains of our commercial strains. And this work, of course, is being done on starting with Voss, which has just been commercially produced by us as well. But I think we'll certainly start to get a more three-dimensional picture of the Kveik cultures as we kind of progress further in terms of characterization. So another question, I've got one from Danielle Boudet. Lars, are these traditional beers, do they get sour over time, or are they too strong? Do they outcompete the Lactobacillus strains?
In general, they don't get sour over time. So a good example is I showed you when I visited Sigmund to brew in 2014. So in the autumn of 2019, so over almost 5 years later, he served me that same beer. He still had the bottle of the beer that we produced when we visited him so many years before. And of course, it wasn't the same beer anymore. It was oxidized, and some of the Kveik ester aroma was gone, but it was perfectly clean. There was no acidity, no funkiness, nothing. So of course, it does happen that they get sour over time, but in general, no, not even the raw ales.
Wow, it's hard to believe that that's the case. Certainly, in a lot of the cultures that we've analysed, we've found very little in terms of bacteria. In a couple of cultures, yeah, 1 or 2 strains, but nothing significant. Anyway. So a question, next one from Danielle Boudet. Again, apologies for pronunciation here. Lars, are these traditional? Oh no, sorry, that's the one we've just had. So the next question is from Carl-Jean Dron Mardi Extragore, and again, apologies for my terrible pronunciation. I am English after all. Where did you source the Lallemand Kveik from, and can it be reused as a normal Kveik? Yeah, good question. Thank you, Carl. As I kind of alluded to in my introduction, I've been sourcing Kveik cultures from a range of sources over a relatively wide time frame. So what we have in our culture collection, which totals over 50 strains now, is from quite a wide range of sources. The LAUTERING, which we've launched, actually came from a homebrewing community in Norway that was sent to a homebrew group in the UK, and we had at least 5 cultures from this group, and those were sent over to our R&D lab in Montreal, and one of the dominant CEREVISIAE strains from a version of the Sigmund strain, the Voss strain, however you want to refer to it. That dominant CEREVISIAE strain was the yeast that was isolated and went into commercial production. And to further answer your question, can it be used and reused as normal Kveik? Absolutely. As with all of our kind of core range of premium dried yeast, they can be cropped, repitched successfully with the right handling. And if I can again refer you to the Lallemand Brewing website, we actually have a one-page best practice document actually on cropping and repitching, recently published. So I hope that would provide you some information. And in fact, Lars, you gave a talk a few weeks ago now for Gourmet Brewing, and the host there had actually taken some of the Lalbrew Voss that he'd used to create the beers for that talk, and he'd actually dried them into flakes I'd seen in the traditional manner. So it'd be interesting to see if that worked in repitching in the traditional way. But
let me talk about that for a second, because he wanted to show what I showed with Terje's yeast, that it could rehydrate and start fermenting during the talk. So he pitched it into apple juice.
Oh wow!
And it didn't start. This I see people ask this question about using mead, and this is one of the main things that you need to know about Kveik. It expects high gravity because you saw Terje and Sigmund. They make quite strong beer, and they rehydrate the yeast in the first wort that comes out, which is even stronger. So these yeasts are really used to a lot of nutrient. They will ferment faster with high gravity. So if you get below 1050 with a wort, then it may not work so well. And with mead and cider, it's even worse. But you can compensate by adding yeast nutrient.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting topic, and I'm sure there's valuable research to be done. I mean, yeast nutrition is, I think, often overlooked in all brewing, and particularly modern brewing, in terms of nitrogen requirements for yeast growth, etc. But be certainly valuable to explore. that further. So I guess that was also answering the question there from where are we? Priyanka Save, just can Kveik work on meads? And I think to echo Lars's comments there, I think with any consideration in anything like mead or indeed cider, where you've got certainly got a carbohydrate source, but not necessarily the source of nitrogen like we do in that is derived from malts and from barley. You've obviously got to pay close attention to the nutritional side of it, but certainly from feedback that we're getting so far, there are a lot of people using these yeasts on meads, on cider. I've even had someone feeding, but they used it on red wine very successfully, and this is also the Kveik cultures are getting huge interest from the distilling world as well. So if we think about these extremely fast fermentation temperatures, the strains obviously vary from culture to culture, but are generally speaking quite highly alcohol tolerant, that they're almost the perfect solution for what distillers are looking for in a quick, efficient yields in distilling. So, this is something that has been on my mind. This almost begs the question: is there anything that Kveik can't do, and is it going to be the super yeast of all future commercial fermentations? For any drink.
Well, I mean, weirdly, it doesn't do low alcohol beers so well. I wouldn't do Hefeweizen nor Saison with it, ironically. And maybe for some things it's a little bit too estery. Although once you get to know the strain or the culture well, you can reduce the ester production.
Well, yes, and I think that's one thing that certainly we're at Lælingen exploring is as wide range of variables as possible to try and really discover what you can get out of the strains or not. And one comment that you made there about low alcohol leads on to just one of the next questions from Heikki Salm. Is there a practice in Norway to collect second or third runnings and make a lower ABV beer or drink?
Yes. Basically, historically, it was finding something that was safe and nice to drink was not easy, and so people made the strong beer, and then they always made the small beer as well, which they would drink instead of the milk, usually sour milk stuff that they usually drank. And there was actually also a way to, after you'd done the second runnings, you could just pour on cold water and leave the mash for a couple of days and then run off stuff that couldn't be fermented because it was too thin, but it would be sour. And there would still be a little bit of nutritional flavor in it. And people would actually do this, add water over and over, and maybe add kitchen scraps as well, because this was also better than the sour milk stuff. And in fact, if you read the book, you will see that this type of beer, the drink that I just described, is probably the origins of what we know as kvass.
Right.
There is an argument for why, but we can't do it here.
No problem. Well, I hope that answered the question there, and they're coming in thick and fast. A question from Carl Dinardo. So Carl says a lot of generalities are clearly being made with Kveik, but with so many strains available, where do you find the differences are mainly presenting? Is this in aroma and flavor, but also behavior, physical behavior such as flocculation perhaps, and maybe other considerations as well?
That's a very good question. They have historically been used almost identically throughout Norway. So the behavior is, there is some difference. Some are faster than others. Some are more heat tolerant and more alcohol tolerant, but roughly the profile is the same there. So the big difference is aroma and flavor, yeah. So there are a couple of cultures that will not take the IBUs with them when they flocculate out of the beer, so they can produce almost unbearably bitter beer if you boil the wort. And then you have this range of aromas, right? The esters. So you have the orange, then you have a number 20 Espe with the plums and cognac kind of flavor. You have the yeast from Stordal with more pineapple and mango kind of flavor. Those can be. You can actually make a fake New England IPA with those. Just a little bit of hops for bitterness, and then let the yeast do the aroma. And there is more as well. So there is a huge range there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Carl, for that question. And certainly we've seen, as you alluded to in the presentation as well, Lars, that some of the strains are POF positive, but I think the vast majority of the Kveik strains that we've come across are not, they're POF negative. So, but certainly a lot of difference in diversity in flavour and aroma. And we've also seen some functional differences as well. So, for example, the sugar utilization in some strains does differ. So we do see variances in attenuation, and flocculation is a key one as well. We generally measure all our strains by an adapted method of the Helms test, which gives you a flocculation rating kind of by percentage, and the Voss strain, for example, has the highest Helm rating out of all our commercial strains. That obviously is an indication of just how flocculent that particular strain is, but there are some which don't flocculate particularly well at all. So thanks for that.
Those could be co-flocculent though. So that when you're using the mixed culture, probably those do flocculate out. But when you isolate them, then they don't.
Yes, and that's the thing about multi-strain cultures, that you know, obviously a lot of those rely on the specific interactions between the strains within the context of a multi-strain culture, and that's certainly something I've experienced in my brewing career using kind of more traditional multi-strain British cultures as well. One question from Chris Watsef was, do you recommend giving more headspace in the fermenter during fermentation as compared to a regular yeast?
Yeah, definitely. At least especially if you are a home brewer, because you will need that headspace. It really wants to escape the fermenter if it can. So in fact, if for people using a normal airlock, it may be a good idea to have a blow-off tube in case the thing is literally blown off. So you can the fermentation can be quite violent, and also it's normal to underpitch Kveik yeast quite a lot, and then you want as much oxygen as possible as well. So in fact, in that case, it's ideal to have an open fermenter.
Yes, I suppose that's what would have been traditionally brewed in. I guess they would be similar to some of the open vessels where we'd get more ester forward yeasts, like the traditional British ale yeasts, and even the Bavarian Hefeweizen yeast, which have those lovely kind of open vessels at the top. I suppose the Krause and the yeast head will vary somewhat strain to strain, but I think with the extremely high temperatures, it would certainly be advisable to make sure you've got enough fermenter space as possible. Just on to the next one. We're covering these as quick as possible. We'll have to call it a day relatively soon, but some great questions coming in. One from Mike Onchulik. Does Kveik beer benefit from maturation periods after fermentation, similar to beer made with normal brewing yeast?
That's a very good question, and I think in general, I would say opinion is divided on that. So some of these brewers say, nope, the beer is best at Uppskåka. And other people say, no, it's much better after 2 or 3 weeks. So that will differ both with the person tasting it and the culture and or strain. I think many people generally would, at least in some cases, enjoy it more after a week or two when it's had time to clear properly. But people are different, so there's no, I don't think there's a simple answer to that.
No, and I guess that would depend on the beer, the strength, and obviously the higher ABV beers are going to lend themselves better to maturation over time, and I guess it also depends on what additions are made. I mean, does juniper tend to age well, or does it change?
In my experience, it's quite stable. It tends to last a good long while. Yeah. In fact, in the wood, it's almost unbelievably stable. So people in Estonia, people make these wooden drinking mugs that are they're sanded, but they're not. There's no lacquer or anything on them. So if you smell an empty one, it smells of juniper. And they say that, you know, if you've used it for 5 or 10 years and the flavor starts to disappear, and you can just sand the inside and it comes back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible stuff. Well, thanks. Another excellent question. Another one from Danielle Budai. What happens if you bottom harvest a blend which has been traditionally top harvested? Does the balance of the strains alter in subsequent generations?
Well, I should start by saying that we have no scientific experiments on this. We just have anecdotal information. But in the beginning, people did have issues that they reused the Kveik, you know, modern brewers, I mean, and it changed behavior. It got less attenuative or didn't behave so well. And our suspicion was that exactly this was the problem. So that's why I made the Kveik registry, which describes how the original brewer uses each of these cultures, and we kind of try to teach people to do the same. That seems to have helped. So it does seem that the balance of the strains does change, although it's not been tested scientifically.
No, and therein lies the challenge of cropping and repitching multi-strain cultures. And certainly a brewery I used to work for, we had a multi-strain of 4 different strains, and we bottom cropped, and we found we generally take it to about 50 generations and then get a new culture, but we found by the end there was only kind of 2 in there. So to get a representative and consistent sample from subsequent repitching is very difficult with multi-strain cultures, but then that wasn't really the point in obviously farmhouse brewing, historic brewing in other countries as well, that there was not, you know, necessarily you know, like we are very precise with inoculation and pitching nowadays, but that mindset certainly didn't exist really, I guess, in farmhouse brewing, and probably still doesn't.
No, they don't expect the beer to be consistent from batch to batch, although they do try to do the same from batch to batch. So they will treat the yeast pretty much the same every time, but like you say, there's no expectation that it's always going to be the same.
No, exactly. So I hope that answered the question there, and I'll jump down to one from Jeff Pregenza, are there any noticeable flavor difference between fermenting Voss at 25C versus at 40C, i.e. banana notes, so specifically esters there you're referring to?
Yeah, I personally haven't had banana from Voss, but it does seem that it does produce less esters at lower temperatures, and the biggest difference seems to be when you get below 20, like start getting down to 15 or 12 degrees, then the ester profile really gets more muted. I'm not sure exactly how low you can go with it, but it's below 12. It's below 10 as well.
Yeah, and certainly this is something that we've obviously tested for, and that reminds me, actually, I need to post the link to David Heath's video into the group, and that video has some of the data that we've made openly available on this particular strain, the Lalbrew Voss, fermenting at different temperatures. And we, generally speaking, at the lower temperatures actually saw a bit more flavor production at the lower temperatures, which is completely counter to what I would expect if you think about ester production, which all revolves around yeast growth. We generally say that higher fermentation temperatures would result in higher esters due to the demand it puts on for yeast growth, but that's not what we've seen. But we certainly need to look into this further, specifically in relation.
This might be to do with the specific strain that you selected out of the mixed culture as well. So you might have selected one that behaves differently from the others.
Yeah, well, that's of course highly possible. But I think that there's more. But generally speaking, yes, you would get different flavor profiles at different temperatures. Generally speaking. Yeah. Dave Pawson asks, have you made bread with Kveik cultures, Lars?
Not me personally, but I know quite a few people have, and have been very happy with the result, actually. So at least one of the Farmhouse brewers has switched to making his bread with Kveik and is very happy about it. So that's definitely something you should try. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've certainly had feedback that it can be used well in baking as well. Down to we'll just take another couple of questions. I know there's a few left, but we'll have to finish soon. Unfortunately, we're way over. But such is the interesting debate. We'll keep going for a few more. Rob Edwards asked, do Lallemand attempt to deliberately mutate yeast to replicate the selective pressures that lead to some of the characteristics? No is the short answer. I think the kind of process you're describing there, Robert, is what we'd, in terms of genetics, what we would refer to as selective breeding. So where you're trying to use different environments, different pressures, different mating techniques to encourage specific traits within a yeast to come out. And obviously selective breeding and that is a very long and time-consuming process, and certainly there are many labs across the globe and some that we know in Europe that certainly work to that technique, but that's not something that we do at Lallemand. It's I think it quite simply we've just isolated a dominant Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain, so we don't then alter the the conditions are to try and breed out specific characteristics, we simply send over a slant of the yeast to our production plant, like any propagation that's grown up in stages into quite a large fermentation and then dried. So I hope that answers the question. I think just one more now, and I'm going to be selfish and ask the last question. I mean, there's many questions that I'd written down that I'm sure I can hassle you about in future, Lars. But I think just on a really broad one to end it, I'm just fascinated by the stories that you tap into and what it says about culture and community. And I guess one sad thing to think about is, did you think it's inevitable that regional cultures and traditions, when it comes to these type of farmhouses, do you think it's inevitable that they will die out eventually?
That's a very good question. I guess in large part, all of this, like doing this talk, writing that book, is to try and make sure that doesn't happen. And the way that I'm trying to make that not happen is, well, we have a great example here, right? We have the world's biggest yeast producer showing interest in Kveik and producing it commercially. That tells people in Voss that, oh, this Kveik that my grandpa used to have is actually something special. It is something valuable. So I'm trying to use the interest that this generates abroad to help people in these regions see that their tradition is valuable and worth carrying on. Basically, to motivate more brewers to take it up. So, but there's always the question of the time scale, right? So I think it's probably safe now for another 50 years, maybe 100.
Well, I guess
this is a tradition that's literally in Norway, probably 6,000 years old. So 50 years is not a lot.
Yeah, well, I guess we now have you to thank. I mean, there are many ways that we can preserve cultures, and you've deposited some of the yeast in the NCYC. And other yeast companies and yeast banks have some of these obviously stock, and so that's one way that as a brewing community is professionals within brewing can preserve it. And obviously now we have amazing books like this that will record that history to a greater extent. But let's hope we can continue to celebrate and to share these traditions. And I think one of the really interesting aspects that I found about your talk is similar to some of the research I've been doing on the history of IPA and the yeast involved within that, which may give you an indication as to a project I'm working on at the moment. But it's really interesting what you describe about Hansen's techniques coming in, and that purification and isolation of yeast largely led to a great homogenization in beer styles and beer flavor. And I think now thanks to the craft beer revolution, obviously starting from the 1980s onwards in the US, we're having this pushback where we're now trying to rediscover and re-diversify beer. And that's one of the exciting things about what we're trying to do at Lælingen is to bring all these, rediscover and celebrate all this diversity within the context of yeast and bacteria. So I'm sure we've got a long way to go as a brewing community, but on behalf of us all, Lars, thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing. Just as a note, you'll see in the comments section I've posted a link to a YouTube page, and that's just David Heath's video on Lalbrew Voss. But we'll leave it there, and apologies if we didn't quite get to your question or if I've missed over something, it wasn't intentional, but I think as is scrolling on the screen for more information, you can email me directly. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. You can get in touch with myself or any of my colleagues at Lælingen via our Facebook page or via our website, and obviously I'm sure Lars would be happy to answer questions, should you wish to contact him as well. But we'll leave it there. Thanks for everyone's participation. Your questions, your comments have been excellent, and I think the fact that we've ran a full hour or nearly a full hour over our scheduled slot just shows you what depth there is to Kveik and farmhouse brewing as a topic. So we'll leave it there. So thank you for everyone, but thank you very much, Lars, for your time, and we very much look forward to hearing your future discoveries and what you come across. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great.